Hello there, everyone. This is part 2 of the Coriolanus story. If you'd like to hear part 1, I'll put a link in the description, but I'll also just do a quick little rundown of his story up to where we left off last time. Marcius, patrician, really good soldier, basically took the Volscian town of Corioli by himself, earning him the nickname Coriolanus. But at odds with the plebeians, and when he made a speech talking out and against the tribunes of the plebs, and well, really the plebeians as a whole, he lost his favor with the mob and was brought to trial. A trial which ended with his banishment from Rome. And that is where we pick up the story. All the other patricians were distraught. They couldn't believe that the highest amongst them had just been punished by mere plebeians. Marcius, though, was cool. It said he didn't look like it even affected him. He left with his head held high and made his way home, where his mother and wife were waiting for him and begging him not to leave. But he just gathered a few things and made his way to the city gate with about 3 or 4 clients to accompany him. Marcius then spent the next week out in the countryside going over his options and trying not to let his anger make his next judgments, because he hadn't really shown the Romans how he felt, but he was absolutely filled with resentment and hatred towards his fellow Romans, who he had done so much for in his eyes. So he came to the conclusion that he would go to one of the other peoples that have been fighting against Rome and join them. And he chose none other than the Volscians. Now, there probably wasn't a more hated Roman amongst the Volscians than the dude who embarrassed them by taking one of their cities all by himself. But Marcius knew the king of the Volscians somewhat personally. Tullus Aufidius, the king, and Marcius in their younger years had been in many of the same battles together, and had said that they often hurled insults and challenges at each other from across the field. So we can assume, like Marcius did, that he didn't really like him. But Marcius also knew that as king, he really, really wanted to retaliate against the Romans. So Marcius made his decision. He would go to Tullus. The only problem was that he couldn't just go walk up to his city like he was just like some guy. No, if Volscian people saw him, they'd jump his ass like he was a crip in a Bloods neighborhood. So he disguised himself and waited till evening to make his way into the city and to the house of Tullus, where he managed to get inside without alerting anyone, and then just sat down by the home's hearth and waited in silence. When somebody finally realized what was going on, they rushed to get Tullus, who was eating his dinner, and when Tullus entered the room, he asked the stranger who he was. Marcius stood and removed the cloak covering his head, and was like, "Sallied, it's me. Now I know you probably aren't happy to see me, but hear me out. Those bitch-ass Romans, they freaking exiled me because they were jealous of how awesome and cool I am, so now I'm pissed. I didn't come here to try and harm you, and I definitely didn't come here to die. I came here because I know that you, just as much as me, want to teach the Romans a lesson and get some revenge for the things that they have done to us." Now, his speech to Tullus was much more eloquent than my version, but you get the point. Tullus, surprised as he was at this turn of events, was nonetheless happy to have one of the former leading Romans join him against the Romans themselves. He invited Marcius to dinner, and then they spent the next few days going over the war to come. Now, since the last war between the Volscians and Romans, a peace treaty had been put in place, and the Romans also didn't really take the Volsci as much of a threat anymore. They were so complacent with the Volsci that when the great games were held in Rome that year, young Volscian men were allowed to attend and to enter the games. The great games, they were an annual festival held in Rome each year where multiple different religious ceremonies were held, and also some games of athleticism and stuff. Well, during the festivities, Marcius and Tullus, they were able to get agents into the city of Rome and they began to spread rumors that during the games, the Volsci were going to attack. And when the rumors made their way to the two consuls of Rome, they decided that they would just have to kick the Volscians out of Rome, and they would not allow them to partake in the ceremonies or in the games. And this, of course, upset the various Volsci that were there in Rome, but they couldn't do anything about it, and they were forced to leave the city. And now, with tensions already running high, Tullus, he stepped in and he began to fan the flames. He started riling up his people, reminding them of the land and the towns that they had lost in the last war to the Romans, until eventually he got them so mad that they decided that they had had enough of these Romans, and they were going to take their stuff back. Tullus also told his people he had the perfect man to bring the war to the Romans. Not wanting to waste any time, Marcius told the Volscian leaders that he wanted to take anybody who was actually ready to go fight right now and go raid into Roman territory while the rest of the army was being mustered. He wanted to hit fast before the Romans even knew what was happening, and he had a strategy. He was going to go attack all of the plebeian-held lands and all their farms, while leaving any patrician-held land alone, and he was hoping that by doing this, he would drive an even bigger wedge between the patricians and the plebs, making it even easier to destroy them both. And he was quite successful in his little lightning raid campaign. It said that he gathered so much loot, the Volscians, they didn't even know what to do with it all. And while he was off raiding, the Volscian army had been assembled and was ready to take the field. And when Marcius returned, Tullus, the king of the Volscians, gave him command of the field army, while he remained back in his own territory with a smaller defense force, and off Marcius went to destroy the Romans. The first town he came to was a colony of Rome, Circe, if that's how you pronounce it. These people were smart, and they submitted to Marcius without a fight, so he allowed them to keep their goods in gold and let the city be. He then made his way into the land of the Latins, where he assumed he would find the Romans waiting for him there, because he had heard of all the different messengers that the Latins had sent to the Romans, asking for help, since they were allied to each other. But the two consuls of that year, they didn't come to the aid of the Latins because their terms were almost up, and they didn't want to possibly end their term in office with a loss to Marcius. Now, this was perfectly okay with Marcius. He assaulted and took the towns of Tolerum, Lavicum, Pedum, and Bola. These cities' inhabitants were either put to the sword or sold into slavery, but for the towns that didn't resist him, he let them off without plundering their goods or taking any slaves. Now, that last town that he subdued, Bola, that was only a little bit over 12 miles from the city of Rome, and in this town, it said that he put almost all of the adults to the sword. So it seems the closer and closer he's getting to Rome, the more and more personal these sieges are becoming, and more of the people within these cities seem to be on his bad side, rather than the first couple towns he took where it doesn't seem that he faced much resistance. Now, back in Rome, people are freaking out. But still, the plebeians were refusing to join the army, and the patricians were unwilling to come to terms with the plebeian leadership. That is, until the news that Marcius had besieged the city of Lavinium. Now, this city was very important to the early Romans because they believed it was the first city that Aeneas had founded when he landed in Italy after the Trojan War, hundreds and hundreds of years before. And the Romans also stored their sacred symbols of their gods in Lavinium at this time. So it was a very, very important place to them. So the plebeians, they changed their tune and actually went to the patricians and said, look, we want to rescind the charges that we laid upon Marcius and allow him to return to Rome, and hopefully when he hears this, he'll stop attacking us. But the patricians, for some reason, they said no. Now, in the beginning, there was plenty of patricians who had stood by Marcius and thought what the plebs had done to him was terrible and unjust. But now, with the plebs wanting to forgive Marcius and allow him to return, the patricians are standing there saying, nope, not going to allow it. either because the patricians didn't want Marcius to think that it was the plebs who had allowed him to return, or because they were now actually against Marcius for turning against Rome and helping the Volscians. It's not exactly clear why they denied the request of the plebs, but when Marcius found out that the plebeians had brought the motion to absolve him of his charges to the Senate, and that the Senate had denied the motions, he stopped his siege of Lavinium and headed straight towards Rome. Marcius brought his Volscian forces all the way up to the Fosse Cluiliae, the Clulian Trench, which was only 5 miles from the city of Rome. This trench had supposedly been built by the Alban king Gaius Clulius during the war between Rome and Alba Longa. It's so close to Rome that you could probably see the Volscian army if there were any buildings or if the walls of Rome were higher than the trees surrounding the city. This, of course, scared the crap out of the Romans, and very quickly the Senate decided that they were going to send ambassadors to Marcius. They decided to send a man who was a relative of Marcius to the Volscian camp, but when he was brought to Marcius, he did not get the answer he was hoping for. When he asked if he would please stop his attack against his countrymen, Marcius was angry and bitter towards his fellow Romans. He demanded that the Volscian territory that was taken in the last war was given back to them, and that a decree should be made giving the Volscians the same type of civic rights with the Romans that the Latins had been given, and that there would be no stopping of the war until those demands were met. And with that, he gave them 30 days to make up their minds, and then he packed up his army and left to go plunder more Roman allies. The Volscians, they weren't too happy with his decision to withdraw. In fact, Tullus, who at this time, he's been overshadowed by Marcius, to the point that nobody listens to him really, and the soldiers, they only really listen to and want to be commanded by Marcius. Well, this made Tullus jealous, and he tried to say that Marcius withdrawing was a betrayal to them, and that they had lost a golden opportunity to have revenge against the Romans. But Marcius, he paid no mind to those accusations, and he continued to raid the Roman allies, and he also took several more of their towns, all while the Romans made no attempt to help their Italian allies. When the 30 days were up, Marcius brought his force back to the Clulian Trench, where again he was met with another Roman embassy. And this time, they told Marcius that if he were just to take the Volscian army out of Roman territory and disband them, that the Senate of Rome would be much more willing to talk peace terms, even if it included giving back the lands of the Volsci. But the Romans, they would make no concessions out of fear. Marcius replied, as the general of the Volsci, he couldn't agree to those terms, not even close. And that as a still citizen of Rome, he would advise them to think very carefully about what they really wanted to get out of this peace deal, because they might just lose everything. He then gave them 3 days to give him an answer, and that they shouldn't return again unless that answer was capitulation, as his camp would be much too dangerous for them to come through again. Well, when the Senate learned of this, the only thing they could think to do was to order all of the various religious officials within the city to put on their religious regalia and go to Marcius and ask again if he would please cease this war against his home. But Marcius again denied their request and sent the leading religious officials of the city back to Rome. And when they returned, it was decided that all they could do was wait quietly in the city and to man the walls in case of an attack. In Plutarch's writing, he goes on to explain how, whether it be due to the gods putting thoughts and feelings into our heads, or maybe it was just done by a person's own volition, but that sometimes a feeling comes over some people to take action, to make a move, and to not just sit there and wait to see what fate has in store for them, but to get up and make their own. It was at this time in the city of Rome, a woman named Valeria got the idea in her head that she and the other women of Rome would go to the house of Volumnia, who was the mother of Marcius, and ask her for her help in getting her son to stop his war against Rome. So they went to Volumnia, and also to Marcius's wife Virgilia, who was with Volumnia at the time, and pleaded with her to go to her son and see if she could get him to change his mind about attacking Rome. She said that she didn't even think her son cared for her anymore, since he had taken up arms against his own city, and she knew that before he had held Rome above all, even her. But in the end, the women were able to convince her to come with them, and she agreed to accompany the rest of the women to the Volscian camp. When they arrived at the camp of the Volscians, the sad state of affairs that they were in caused even the Volscians to remain quiet and respectful towards the women. Marcius, who was with his council, was made aware of the women, and when he saw who was leading the procession, he couldn't help himself. He jumped up from his seat and ran towards his mother and wife, who had brought his children with them as well. It said that he didn't hold any emotion back, and that he let his tears flow as he held them in his arms for as long as the moment allowed. Then, when he was ready, and he saw that his mother had come to say something to him, he stepped back with the men of the Volsci and let his mother say what she had come to tell him. Plutarch says her words were the following: "Thou seest, my son, even if we do not speak ourselves and can't judge from the wretchedness of our garb and aspect, to what a pitiful state thy banishment has reduced us. And now be sure that we who come to thee are all of women most unhappy, since fortune has made the sight which should have been most sweet, most dreadful for us, as I behold my son, and this wife of thine her husband, encamped against the walls of our native city. And that which for the rest is an assuagement of all misfortune and misery, namely prayer to the gods, has become for us most impracticable. For we cannot ask from the gods both victory for our country and at the same time safety for thee, but that which any one of our foes might implicate upon us as a curse, this must be the burden of our prayers. For thy wife and children must needs be deprived either of their country or of thee. As for me, I will not wait to have the war decide this issue for me while I live, but unless I can persuade thee to substitute friendship and concord for dissension and hostility, and so to become a benefactor of both parties rather than a destroyer of one of them, then consider and be well assured that thou canst not assail thy country without first treading under foot the corpse of her who bore thee. For it does not behoove me to await that day on which I shall behold my son either led in triumph by his fellow citizens or triumphing over his country. If, then, I asked you to save your country by ruining the Volscians, the question before thee would be a grievous one, my son, and hard to decide. Since it is neither honorable for a man to destroy his fellow citizens, nor just for him to betray those who have put their trust in him. But as it is, we ask only a relief from evils, something which would be salutary for both parties alike, but more conducive to fame and honor for the Volscians, because their superiority in arms will give them the appearance of bestowing the greatest of blessings, namely peace and friendship, although they get these no less themselves. If these blessings are realized, it will be chiefly due to thee, and if they are not, then thou alone will bear the blame for both nations. And though the issues of war are obscure, this is manifest, that if victorious, thou will only be thy country's destroying demon, and if defeated, the world will think that to satisfy thy wrath, thou did bring down the greatest calamities upon men who were thy benefactors and friends." Marcius stood there in silence for a long, long moment. Then his mother began again, pleading with him and questioning him until she finally threw herself down at his feet in anguish. At this, Marcius cried out, "What hast thou done to me, my mother?" He then picked her up and took her by the hands, and for a time he and his mother and wife spoke privately, and when they were done, he sent them back to Rome, and then took his army away from the city. Now the Volscians, they were like, "Hey, what the fuck, man? Like, really sweet and emotional, like, great stuff, but, like, we came here for a reason." But Marcius, I guess, because they respected him so much, nobody wanted to go against his orders. Nobody went against his orders, and the Volscians agreed to end the siege. Of course, many of them were not happy with Marcius at all, but it said many of them weren't really, or couldn't really be mad at him or blame him because of what had happened, and they understood the emotional toll the meeting with his mother must have taken. The Romans, though, they were happy as hell. They threw open their temples, started partying in the streets. It was a great time for them. The women, who had saved the city from destruction, were told that they could have anything they wanted, but they decided all they would like is that a new temple dedicated to the goddess Fortuna was built in the name of the women inside the city, which they would also pitch in for themselves. They just wanted the public to take care of all the different sacrifices that were to be done at the temple. As for Marcius, or Coriolanus, if you'd like to call him, well, he made his way back to Antium, the lands of the Volsci, where Tullus, who by now really didn't like Marcius for stealing all his thunder, began to plot against him. Tullus was still the chief of the Volsci, so he ordered Marcius to disband his army, and also that Marcius needed to come and give a full accounting of his time in charge. See if he was skimming some off the top or not while he was in charge of the Volscian forces. Well, Marcius said, "No problem, I'll give up command. I mean, the only reason why I have it is because you guys wanted me to be in charge, so no big deal. And sure, I'll come give you guys a rundown of my time in charge, and we can go over all the books and shit. Not a problem for me." When the assembly was called to determine the fate of Marcius, at first Tullus and his supporters, they tried to stir up resentment in the Volscian crowd against Marcius, but when Marcius himself rose to speak, the crowd grew silent, and as they listened to him recount the deeds he had performed for them, even bringing up that, yes, I did withdraw from Rome when we had the city beat, but the only reason why you were even there in the first place was because of me, okay? So relax, don't come at me with that. Well, Tullus could see that Marcius and his speech, they were beginning to win the crowd over, and he and his conspirators, they were having none of that. Tullus ordered one of his men to attack Marcius, and while crying out that the Volscians shouldn't listen to this treacherous Roman, and that he was going to try and become their tyrant, he lunged at Marcius and began to cut at him with his sword. Marcius, who was unarmed, had no chance. It said that not a single person stepped forward to try and protect Marcius, and he died where he fell. The Volscians, they took his body, and they actually gave him an honorable burial and decorated his tomb with many different gifts, as if he was one of their own chiefs. But when the Romans heard of his death, they gave it no attention at all. They didn't honor him or try to vilify him at all. The women of his household, they were allowed to mourn for the customary 10 months, and that was it. The wars between the Volsci and the Romans are far from over, but with the loss of Marcius, the Volsci, they didn't really stand a chance against the Romans, and they will eventually end up being conquered by the year 300 BC. And that is all she wrote about Gaius Marcius Coriolanus, the Roman hero turned traitor. But before I go, I'd like to just do a little modern take on the events, like I kind of did with the Catiline conspiracy. I came to the conclusion that I thought that Caesar was probably behind Catiline. He just wanted to see how far Catiline could take his coup. I think he might have just used it as a sort of a trial run when he would eventually try and take control of the Roman state. In this instance here, I think it could be possible that the later Romans came up with this story of Marcius as a way of kind of being like, yeah, they didn't beat us. The Volsci, I mean. Actually, It was a Roman guy who was leading them, and that's the only reason why they were so good. And, once he left, we were able to beat them again, and, it was super easy. Probably trying to save face or make up an excuse for this time period where they were losing against the Volsci and in danger of actually being overrun by them. But either way, true or not, it's a good story, and I hope you enjoyed listening. And I also hope you have a good one.